The snow thickened, falling in heavy, relentless sheets, transforming the valley into a white void. Boots sank ankle-deep into frost-crusted drifts. Every step was a struggle. Every breath burned through lungs already raw from cold. Fingers were stiff, faces pale, lips cracked, and noses bright red with frostbite. Even the soldiers who had survived years of war trembled. Hans Meyer led the column, shoulders hunched beneath the weight of his rifle and the unspoken responsibility for the men behind him. His mind raced, cycling between memories of battle and the reality of surrender. I am responsible for them. Not just for keeping them alive, but for their sanity. For their souls, what's left of them. Behind him, Klaus, barely 17, stumbled. His blue lips trembled as he muttered prayers that seemed empty. I can't feel my toes. I think they're dead. Hans's jaw tightened. Then keep moving, you idiot. Panic and you freeze for real. Do you want to die before we even reach the Americans? Klaus whimpered and trailed behind, dragging his rifle. His eyes kept darting toward the fogged horizon, where shadowy American forms appeared like phantoms. Fritz Keller, sitting cross-legged on a drift when they paused, muttered bitterly, I'd give anything for one warm bed, one night without frost in my ass. Even a woman's hand on my shoulder. Fuck, I'd die happy right now. Hans exhaled smoke from his cigarette, letting it drift into the gray sky, a fragile shield against despair. He shook his head, lips cracked and dry. Survive first. Desire later. That's the rule. Keller sneered, rubbing frost-bitten fingers together. You sound like a priest preaching to corpses. Hans's voice dropped low, almost a growl. Maybe. Or a man tired of corpses and children frozen in snow. The march continued, each step a negotiation with death. Snow crept into boots, soaking socks and turning toes to ice. Frost-bitten hands clung to rifles, shaking uncontrollably. Hunger gnawed at stomachs like a living thing, every breath a reminder that the body demanded food that wasn't coming. A corporal, staggering and drunk on a stolen bottle of alcohol, tripped over a snow mound, muttering under his breath. I'd trade every medal I ever earned for a hot meal, or a warm bed, or a woman. Fuck it, anything warm. A veteran near him, Muller, barked. You're an idiot. You'll freeze your ass off and still be whining about warmth. Better dead than crawling like rats in the snow, muttered another soldier, teeth chattering. The wind cut across the valley, sharp and unforgiving, tearing through scarves and jackets, biting flesh exposed to the air. Each soldier felt it in a primal way, the immediate threat of death, not from bullets, but from cold, exhaustion, and the despair of surrender. As the column approached the Americans, fear escalated. Every movement was scrutinized. The young recruits imagined rifles aimed at them, even though no shots rang out. Each flinch, each stumble was a potential death sentence in their minds. They'll shoot us anyway. They've waited long enough. Klaus thought, eyes wide. Shut the fuck up, Hans hissed. You live by walking, not whining. Even the Americans seemed surreal, calm, collected, and terrifying in their quiet authority. A sergeant approached Hans, cigarette dangling from his lips. Hands visible. Slowly. Hans obeyed, heart hammering, the warmth of desire for life, survival, and even human touch mixing into a strange, almost erotic tension. He thought of Anna, his wife, and the memory made his chest ache with longing. For a brief moment, he could almost feel her warmth, her hands on his frostbitten skin, and it was enough to keep panic at bay. Fritz Keller muttered to Hans while keeping a careful eye on the Americans. I swear, if we make it through, the first thing I do is find a woman and, well, I won't describe it, but it'll be the sweetest thing I've ever felt. Hans shook his head, lips twitching with a faint smile. Survive first, fool. Then dream of pleasures. Right now, you'll die from frost or fear before anything else. Corporal Richter, drunken and cynical, spat into the snow. Mercy? Mercy. I'll take a bottle and die warm before I bend a knee for anyone. A brief fight erupted over a blanket, Muller and a younger recruit shoving, swearing. Hans stepped in sharply. Enough. You'll kill each other before they get the chance. The tension hung in the frozen air, mingling with smoke and snowflakes, an invisible weight pressing down on every soldier in the column. Frosted breath mingled with smoke from distant fires. Shadows stretched long across drifts and ruins. The snow swallowed every sound except the crunch of boots, muttered curses, and whispered prayers. Soldiers' eyes were haunted, faces pale, hands trembling, some lost to hallucinations of fire and blood. Hans's mind drifted. This is the edge of the world. One false step and it will swallow us whole. One misjudged glance, and we die, or worse, survive broken and haunted. Even amid terror and frost, desire lingered. Thoughts of Anna, human warmth, a stolen touch, fleeting, impossible, but enough to keep the pulse of life steady. He-Pow camp sprawled across the frozen valley, gray and endless, its barbed wire zigzagging over snowdrifts like a web of silent intent. Soldiers huddled around meager fires, faces pale, lips cracked, breaths rising in clouds that mingled with smoke from burning wood. Each man moved slowly, stiffened by frostbite and exhaustion, their eyes haunted by the months of battle, the frozen comrades they had left behind, and the uncertainty of life beyond the wire. Corporal Hans Meyer moved among them, checking faces, nudging shivering hands into gloves, distributing scraps of bread, offering words that sounded hollow even to himself. Behind him, young Klaus shivered violently, muttering prayers he barely believed. Hans crouched beside him and pressed a piece of bread into his frozen fingers. "You'll need it," he murmured, though even as he spoke, he doubted the words could carry any comfort. Across the camp, Lieutenant Fisher moved among the prisoners, her presence radiating warmth against the bitter cold. She was young, competent, and unyielding, yet the sight of her in the gray landscape was almost unbearable to some men. Private Becker slumped near the fire, staring at her with hollow, desperate eyes. Frost had stiffened his hands and cheeks, but it was not the cold that made him ache, it was the realization that life could end at any moment, and he wanted, craved, some fragment of human connection before it did. He shifted closer, trembling, brushing against her sleeve almost reverently. Her gaze lifted, steady and calm, and for a heartbeat, the frozen world fell away. Words were unnecessary. The simple, fleeting contact was a reminder of warmth, of life, of everything the war had stolen. Hans, watching from a few feet away, understood the desperation. War stripped men to their most primitive human instincts, survival, longing, and the urgent need to feel alive, even if only for a single heartbeat. He thought, mercy comes in many forms. Sometimes it's survival. Sometimes it's a hand held before the end. Klaus whispered softly from the corner, voice trembling. "Do they really care?" Hans shook his head, his jaw tight. "Not for us, not really. But for the part of us that hasn't frozen yet. That part survives." A fight broke out nearby over a blanket. Muller, a veteran whose fingers were blue and stiff, yanked it from a younger recruit. "Give me that. You think your frostbite's worse than mine?" The boy snapped. "Touch it, and I'll shove it where the sun don't shine." Hans stepped between them, voice low but commanding. "Enough. You'll kill each other before they get the chance." Snow muffled the shouts as shadows of men flickered in the firelight, faces pale and drawn, haunted by fear and the memory of death. Corporal Richter, drunk and cynical, spat into the snow. "Mercy? For mercy. I'll take a bottle and die warm before I kneel for anyone." Hans's jaw tightened. "Then drink and freeze, Richter. Survive first. Morality comes later." Becker, still watching Fisher, muttered under his breath, "If I don't die from frost, I'd give anything for just one hand on my shoulder." Fisher passed, laying her hand briefly on his shoulder, firm but measured, a gesture of empathy that spoke more than words. Becker shivered violently, but it was no longer entirely from cold. It was from the knowledge that this brief contact was a fragile, fleeting touch of humanity in a frozen world. Even in the bitter cold, desire lingered. Hans thought of Anna, his wife, and the memory sent warmth through his chest, an ache that burned sharper than frostbite. He imagined her touch, the softness of her hair, the press of her warmth against his skin, a private defiance against despair. Keller, sitting cross-legged, muttered, "One more bit, I die happy right now." Hans exhaled smoke from his cigarette, bitter and raw. "Survive first, fool. That's the only thing that matters right now." Even frostbitten fingers and hollow stomachs could not erase the longing, the desperate need to feel alive, to touch, to be touched, before the cold claimed them. Fires flickered, casting long shadows that danced across faces etched with fatigue, fear, and longing. Small acts, passing a cigarette, sharing a blanket, muttered jokes, a glance that lingered, were victories in a world that had stolen everything else. The snow drifted heavier now, muffling voices, swallowing shouts, leaving only the sound of boots crunching, the crackle of fire, and the whispered prayers of men frozen to the bone. Hans moved quietly among them, observing, guiding, carrying the weight of their survival. Even in this frozen valley, amidst despair and death, life persisted. A hand on a shoulder, a shared blanket, a fleeting glance. They were enough to keep the fragile pulse of humanity alive, even if only for a moment. The valley, cruel and silent, was still a place where warmth, desire, and empathy could exist, as fragile and fleeting as snowflakes in a storm. The valley was quiet now, the wind sighing across snow that stretched endlessly, reflecting the pale winter light. The POW camp lay sprawled before them, a patchwork of gray tents, smoldering fires, and frozen soldiers who huddled together, exhausted, frightened, yet alive. Corporal Hans Meyer led the remaining column toward the main American encampment. Each step was deliberate, careful, weighted with the knowledge that every motion might mean survival or death. Frostbite had stiffened their fingers and faces, hunger had hollowed their bellies, and months of battle had etched terror into their eyes, yet they walked on. Klaus stumbled beside him, eyes wide and unblinking. "Do you think they'll let us live?" he whispered, voice brittle. Hans kept his gaze forward, scanning the rows of American soldiers who waited silently, rifles lowered but vigilant. "They will," he said finally, voice low and steady. "Not because they owe us anything, but because surviving is the only thing that matters now. You'll live if you keep walking." Fritz Keller shuffled along, shivering violently, rubbing frost-bitten hands together. "I don't care how. Just as long as it ends without me freezing in the snow," he muttered. Hans exhaled a thin cloud of smoke from his cigarette and thought of Anna, of warmth, of life before the endless march. He held the memory close, a fragile ember against the frozen despair surrounding them. As they neared the American line, the tension grew palpable. The soldiers in front paused, raising white flags, torn shirts, handkerchiefs, pieces of bedding tied to rifles. The surrender was silent, surreal, and frightening in its inevitability. Private Becker's eyes locked on Lieutenant Fisher, who moved among the men distributing blankets and supplies. A shiver ran through him, not from the cold alone, but from the desperate longing to feel human warmth before the frost or fate claimed him. She rested a hand briefly on his shoulder, a small, measured touch that seemed to carry the weight of mercy. Becker exhaled shakily, letting the sensation anchor him in the fragile certainty that he was still alive. Hans watched from nearby. War had stripped them to their core, survival, desire, fear, and fleeting moments of connection. A hand held, a blanket shared, a word whispered. These were victories in a world dominated by death. Even amid frostbite, hunger, and exhaustion, human warmth endured. One touch, one glance, one shared cigarette, he thought. That is enough to keep a man alive. The American sergeant approached Hans, calm and deliberate. Hands visible. Slowly. No sudden moves, he instructed. Hans obeyed, heart pounding, eyes scanning the line. In the soldier's measured authority, there was no malice, only the quiet weight of power restrained. The line of surrendered soldiers shuffled forward under his watchful eye, each step a testament to endurance. Around the camp, small gestures of human connection continued. Hands brushed as blankets were passed, cigarettes changed possession, quiet words of encouragement drifted across the snow. The men had endured months of fighting, starvation, frostbite, and fear, yet here, in surrender, they found fragile intimacy, fleeting reassurance that life was still theirs to hold. Keller whispered beside Hans, "If I don't freeze tonight, I'd give anything for a warm bed, even a woman's hand, anything to feel alive for 1 second." Hans shook his head softly, a faint smile tugging at his cracked lips. "Survive first," he replied. "Everything else is just noise." Even in the frozen valley, even in the shadow of death, human desire persisted, a reminder that they were alive, that warmth and connection, however fleeting, could endure. Fires flickered against the snow, casting long, trembling shadows across faces etched with terror and exhaustion. The soldiers huddled close, sharing blankets and murmured words, drawing warmth not only from fire but from the presence of one another. Every glance, every touch, every shared moment of survival became sacred, a defiance of the frost, the hunger, and the constant brush with death. Hans moved among the men, guiding, observing, carrying the quiet weight of responsibility. He understood now that surrender was not shame, it was life. Not defeat but survival. Not humiliation, but a chance to rebuild what remained of humanity in the frozen void of war. As the sun dipped lower, a pale twilight settled over the valley. The snow, unending and white, blanketed the scars of battle, the bodies that had not survived, and the frozen tears of those who had. Fires crackled weakly, casting warmth across frost-bitten hands and faces, marking small islands of life in a frozen sea. The Valley of Surrender was no longer just a place of fear. It was a crucible where humanity endured. Hans leaned back against a snow-covered embankment, frost gnawing at his fingers, exhaustion weighing on every limb, and exhaled slowly. The men around him shared blankets, whispered memories, passed cigarettes, and for the first time in weeks, allowed themselves to breathe. Life persisted, stubborn and fragile. Mercy, trust, desire, and survival coexisted in the cold, and for a fleeting moment, they were enough. In the frozen silence of surrender, Hans thought, "We survived, not as soldiers of pride, not as victors, but as men who chose life over death. That is enough." Around him, the men accepted this truth, small embers of humanity glowing in the cold, shadowed valley. Frost, fear, and the memory of war would linger, but life, messy, fragile, and beautiful, endured.